Very sad news today, Tim. The confirmation that the body of Mike Lynch, the technology entrepreneur, has finally been recovered and identified off the coast of Sicily after his luxury yacht sank. His daughter Hannah, still missing, also presumed to have died along with four others. It's an awful story that has gripped the country, and we'll be speaking to Albert Tait, our reporter in Porticello, and a salvage expert on how a yacht can sink so quickly.
We're also going to talk about GCSE results, and as private schools pull ahead, we ask, does this prove that private education works?
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Kamal Ahmed.
And me, Tim Stanley. It's an appalling tragedy, and it just seems remarkable that a £30 million yacht could sink 500 metres just off the coast of Sicily. But before we get into how that might have happened and what happens next, let's talk about the man at the centre of this tragedy, Mike Lynch. Kamal, I believe you've met him.
Yeah, it's a few times. When I was business editor here at the Telegraph in the 2010s, this was just at the time that he had sold his company, Autonomy, a technology company, which was a very early adopter of how to sift lots and lots of data, voicemails, emails, texts, and be able to see themes, and particularly sometimes be able to spot fraud. So it was a technology company which many businesses used to be able to make sense of the huge amounts of technological information they were producing. That was Autonomy. And he sold that business to the huge American computer giant Hewlett-Packard. He was a hugely significant player in the technology world, and I interviewed him and spoke to him about the UK's technology industry. Why hadn't a Google been invented out of the UK? David Cameron had famously said, why has there never been a UK Google? And Mike Lynch was actually someone who was a mathematician, a computational expert, who was very obsessed with this idea of how do we build a real technology business in the UK. And after he sold Autonomy, and obviously it made him very wealthy, he started a fund called Invoke, which was all about supporting young entrepreneurs in the United Kingdom. So he had a big role in building his own very successful businesses. Autonomy had another one called Darktrace, which were involved in many of the same types of areas. He also was very important for supporting entrepreneurialism in the UK and therefore supporting our economy. So his importance went beyond his businesses. But he was also controversial.
Yeah.
When when Hewlett-Packard bought Autonomy, it was about a year later, what's called a write-down. They said that what had been sold to them was not as valuable as what they thought they were going to get. And this led to this huge legal battle between Hewlett-Packard and Mike Lynch and other senior former executives from Autonomy.
Leading to his extradition
yes,
to the United States.
Exactly. It led to his extradition to the United States. He went there and he faced 15 criminal charges along with other executives from former executives from Autonomy. And it was very recently that all of those, he was found not guilty in all of those, on all of those charges. So the tragedy of the events of Monday morning of this week was sort of compounded by the fact that this is what he had called his sort of second life, because he had become, from this position when I interviewed him, and he's a very polite, quietly spoken, as I say, mathematical expert. He is he was partially deaf, so he had to lip read you very carefully. And so that he came across as almost quite introvert, although incredibly smart. He then went through this 13-year battle over his reputation, over Autonomy itself, and then suddenly to be found not guilty of these 15 charges. That release, he said it was like a near-death experience, that he'd come back. And this was a celebration. He had got friends and his lawyers and his supporters together on the Bayesian, his his boat, and that was what has made this tragedy not more poignant, because all tragedies are desperate and harrowing, but it gave an extra gloss to it because he had just seen how his future could be much more positive, and he could resurrect his battle to do good in the UK tech space. And having met him, I met him a few times through the extradition work that he was doing about why he shouldn't be extradited and how he was going to defend himself. And speaking to him, he was crushed that this had become the way he was going to be remembered was this. So being acquitted was such a moment of positivity for him, his family. It just brings a sharper focus into the events that we're now talking about.
And his death was so incredibly random. This is whatever happened would have happened very quickly. And the people who made the boat insist that this was an unsinkable vessel. Of course, everyone says that, but it is the speed and the drama and the mystery around it that I think has captured so many people's attentions.
It is very similar, isn't it, to the Titan submarine?
Yeah.
That went down and obviously disappeared with the loss of life. This idea that one moment, in this sense, literally, you're bobbing on a calm sea in the beautiful sunshine, and a day later there is horror and death, and that does touch something, I think, in all of us about the fragility of life. And then, of course, what has happened. And in these types of situations, you're only going to know over time what has happened. And we're going to dig into this in this podcast. We're going to be joined by a salvage expert. But first of all, let's speak to Albert Tait, our reporter from the Telegraph, who's been in Porticello in Sicily, where all these events have been unfolding. We're now joined by Albert Tait, our reporter in Porticello, where a lot of the bodies have very sadly been brought ashore and near where the actual sinking happened. Thanks so much for joining us, Albert. Just to kick us off, take us through your week and the unfolding story.
Of course. I mean, I arrived here on Monday, so around 12 hours after the first reports came in that the boat had sank. Everything's been taking place here in Porticello. It's just off the coast here that Mike Lynch's yacht was anchored, and where it ultimately sank. And just to kind of paint a picture, it's a very small fishing village, not very touristy. However, in the last sort of 3 or 4 days, it's been absolutely taken over by emergency services, ambulances, divers, police, virtually everybody involved in the search. There's also more than 100 journalists here because of all the guests from around the world. You've got press from around the world as well. So really, this very quiet fishing village has just been absolutely sort of changed beyond measure. I've been here since Monday, which is around sort of 12 hours after the Mike's yacht, the Bayesian, sank. Everything's been centered around here in Porticello. It was here that his yacht was anchored, and it was here, just off the coast, that it sank. And just to sort of paint a picture for you, it's a very small fishing village, not very touristy, sort of 10 miles off the coast of down the coast from Palermo. But it's been completely transformed in the last few days. It's been completely taken over by emergency services, divers, police, everybody involved in the search, and also hundreds of journalists, photographers. Because the guests were from all around the world, you've got really the global press has descended on this very small village. In terms of what we've been doing over the last 4 days, it's mainly been about trying to get an insight into how the search has been going. We've been hearing about the difficulties they've been having about accessing the cabins. We've been sort of constantly communicating with the firefighters and the Coast Guard who are leading the search operation about how it's been developing, who have been keeping us updated. As the days have gone on, it's become more and more clear that this is no longer a rescue mission, but it's now a recovery mission. And we also had the sad news that 5 bodies have been recovered so far, with just one missing. So that's where we are at the moment.
And Albert, I think it's always surprising, isn't it, in the Mediterranean, off an island where many of us will have been on holiday, that a rescue mission is so difficult. The boat has gone quite deep. It's 15 meters down. And that has meant that the rescuers are only able to spend a very short amount of time down there. And also, I think, have been hampered by, the floating furniture and obviously very, very difficult conditions. You imagine those kind of conditions if you're trying to rescue people in the Antarctic or something, or the middle of the Atlantic. But actually, as you say, within almost eyesight of the coast, it's been clear that the rescue mission, and now, as you say, the recovery mission, has been very, very hard. How do the Coast Guards, do they do a sort of daily press conference? How are you being kept in touch with all that, and what details can you furnish us with?
Of course. So no, there's no sort of daily press conference. They're not particularly communicative with the press out here. We've been speaking to their spokesman, who's been kind of keeping us up to date. But you're absolutely right. It has been a search that's really been hampered by difficulties. But I think they can only spend 14 minutes down there. These divers, 4 of those minutes they've got to spend going down and going up. So really, they've only got 10 minutes at a time to search. They're also sort of having to rotate in teams of 3. So yeah, look, it's completely understandable why this search has gone on for so many days. They have been hampered by sort of a series of difficulties. They can only stay down there for 14 minutes at a time. 4 of those minutes they've got to spend going down and then going back up. So they're rotating in team of 3s, these divers. And you can imagine this is a £30 million yacht. It's going to be furnished with all sorts of things. That will all be floating around. So the difficulty, it's very understandable. I think what we've seen change in the last few days is more divers have come in. We've had remote controlled vehicles have come in as well, which have been able to search for much longer periods, which has now yielded the discovery of 5 bodies. So I think in the last day or so, it's really ramped up, and it's really changed.
Have you been able to speak, Albert, to any maritime experts there, or fishermen or people who know that bit of coast well? There's obviously been pictures of boats being buffeted around. There's been suggestions that the very bad weather was predicted. Have any local people there or experts who have flown in been able to give you any information about what may have happened to cause this boat, which, as you say, has been described by the boat builders as more or less unsinkable, to go down with such tragic results?
So yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So at the moment, it's just theories. We have to wait for the prosecutors to speak to all the survivors, all the witnesses, and come up to their conclusion as to why the boat did sink. One of the suggestions is that the portholes, that one of those could have perhaps been open, and that if the boat tilted, it could have taken on water. We've had sort of unconfirmed reports that one of the portholes was open, but again, that's been reported by Italian media. We haven't been able to firm that up. Another theory is the keel, the retractable keel. This is something that's underneath the boat. It's sort of like it's a flap that stabilizes it in the water. Not a lot of sailing boats have these retractable keels, but we know that the Bayesian did. And if this was retracted, as some Italian media have reported, it could have mean the boat was a lot less stable. So obviously you've seen the boat manufacturers have come out this morning and said it is unsinkable, and sort of which leads to the suggestion that there is some sort of human error at play. Again, we can't speculate on that. We know that prosecutors spoke to the captain yesterday for around 2 hours, but what about? Again, we're unsure of those details. So at the moment, nothing's confirmed yet. But what we do know is it's very rare for this to have happened. There are a lot of unanswered questions about how this has happened. So I think that's something that will come out in future days, or perhaps even weeks.
Do we know if any other boats sank in the bay at the same time or in the same area?
No. As far as we know, none. It was just the Bayesian. So we've got the boat that rescued them. It was a Dutch captain. He sort of talked about coming across them on the lifeboat. He's mentioned that sort of it was very stormy conditions, but none of the other boats seem to have been affected. Which has led to questions about why was it the Bayesian? Was it something to do? It's got the second largest mast in the world of any sailing yacht. Whether that had something to do with it, and again, this is why the suggestion of human error has sort of been thrown around. about whether they didn't see the storm coming, whether they weren't prepared for it. Again, these are questions we just don't know at this point. But as far as we know, it was just the Bayesian that was affected by the storm and sank.
Thanks so much, Albert, reporting there from Porticello.
We're now joined by Bertrand Sciboz, who is a marine salvage and diving expert at the French company Ceres. Bertrand, how does a boat like this, so expensive, so modern, so apparently unsinkable, how could a boat like this sink so fast?
By the way, it's always the same story. You know, when a boat sunk, there is many facts. It never, except if it's sunk by a torpedo, of course, but it's never got one reason. It's a few reasons at the same moment, you know.
Right.
I mean, every boat we salvages, every boat we made some inquiries and investigation to find the way and why it sank for the justice or anything, you know, while looking at every small event who could happen during a short lap of time, you know. And to tell you the truth, you know, I don't like to speculate, to put any conjectures, you know.
Understood.
My main job is to work on facts. And we don't have a lot of facts at the moment because most are very confidential, and I'm sure that the insurer, owner, or divers have some proper fact who could help to find the truth. But what we know exactly is we had one boat was at mooring. We don't know at the moment if you had one anchor or two anchors. This boat was very close to the shore. You know, it's 500 meters close to the shore, to a little harbor in Sicily. And then this boat was in the night. Lights were on, and some of people were awake and some were sleeping. That means some people were on the deck or not far from the deck, and some other were on the cabins. We know this boat got a keel who can be taken off and back in to go in ports. We know that this boat has one of the bigger masts of this kind of sailing vessels. And that's what we know exactly. So we can make we can imagine this boat going on a tornado. I suppose it's done to go well, but in fact it was at mooring, which is quite different because it cannot move from the wind. So we can imagine the tornado pushing this boat out of his lines, you know, and going at something like 30 degrees, more than 40 degrees. And I'm sure, as it is very warm at this moment in the Mediterranean Sea, that windows were open, but also maybe portholes in cabin. So if you make a conjugation of all that things, you can imagine water coming in, and then it's very quick.
As a layman who doesn't sail a great deal, when I look at images of the vessel, I'm struck by the extraordinary size of the mast, which, as you say, can be balanced by the keel. Does this not inherently make a vessel like that more vulnerable, to have such an extraordinary gargantuan mast?
Yeah, of course, but I think engineers and constructors are doing well and been trying well their own job, you know. And anyway, I'm sure this kind of boat, and this boat particularly, have been going through main storms, the biggest storms, but they were shipping, they were not at mooring, which is a really big difference, I think, because a sailing vessel is meant to ship and sail. But at mooring, the condition of sea, everything is quite different. And this big mast must work at a proper sail, you know. And this mast is not made to take wind from the side, you know, by the way. So, but anyway, what you can also imagine about the mast is a very, very important thing for the future, is the fact that the ship is still on the bottom, But when they will put the ship on the right place, I mean the keel on the bottom, the mast will be 30 meters off the surface, which is very big, you know.
In an event such as this, what can make the difference between getting off the vessel and not being able to get off? Why, in other words, are some people able to escape and other people, why might they have been trapped and unable to escape?
Oh, maybe some people were asleep, you know, and you don't have time, you know. I've got hundreds of story of people being trapped in the sleep, and so when you sleep, you know, when things go in 10 minutes, and you cannot grow with just growing a mountain if the ship is at 40 degrees, you know, you cannot escape for sure. It's just like a trap. I mean, people were close to the investigation anyway, or the prosecutor or all the lawyer will know that after got answer from survivors. But I suppose people who were on the upper deck are most survivors, and people who were on the lower deck didn't have the possibility to really escape from the vessel, you know, because the vessel got a strong and stronger degrees with the wind and then sank. So then it's finished.
When a disaster like this happens and the vessel goes to the bottom of the sea, what are the first steps that the search team takes? What will they have done in this instance? What would be the first things they would have done?
Well, when you arrive on just a fresh wreck, I mean, sorry about the term fresh wreck, but it's what we say. Just a new wreck, you know, just been sinking a few hours before. The first thing you think is it possible to have people still alive inside? So you look how is the wreck, you know, and you look all the hair could have been doing some bubble inside. Just to see if it's possible. So you try to hear if you can hear some noise, and you smack on the hull to see if somebody answer you. But it's very, very rare when it's happened. You know, I know it's happened a few years ago, and I saw a crew been rescuing after a few days on board, but it was not at 50 meters. It was not in those conditions. So I'm pretty sure in those conditions it didn't take very long. You know, people were just like a washing machine, you know, and then sunk on the bottom and then got the water and it's finished, you know, just a few minutes.
So once it has become clear that people can't be physically rescued, then what is it that search divers are there to do? Does this move on to gathering of recovery and gathering of evidence?
Oh, yes, of course. The evidence, it's not the first thing. The first thing when a ship sinks is to rescue the bodies. Rescue the people, of course, but rescue the bodies. It's just something which is purely human. It's for the family, and it's for everyone, you know, to rescue the bodies. And then can start the investigation, proper investigation. So when the time of rescuing and salvaging bodies is finished, they will try to find evidence. And that is the reason they already got a robot, an ROV with them, you know. And the idea is to then prepare the salvage, because when you have the first evidence done by divers, it's very important because that block everything, and you have the first evidence always on camera and on images. And then you can start thinking about salvaging the vessel, which another thing, and which will give more evidence when the ship will be at the surface.
And who exactly will be in charge of the investigation, and who will report on the findings?
Oh, it's international law says that, but the boat is UK, but the water is Italian. So I suppose the Italian will do all the investigation for the moment, with the help, of course, of UK authorities. That's what is done usually. When you've got a French boat in the English water or in the inverse, it's always a cooperation between authorities. But the main authorities for the moment are Italian. Sicilian, by the way.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people watching this tragic accident will be wondering just how on earth it could have happened. The vessel is so large; it's the kind of thing that one spends a lot of money on to be safe and secure. It was, as you say, moored. Other boats haven't sunk. We in England think of the Mediterranean as being relatively peaceful. I appreciate that it's not, but that's the way that it's perceived. How does one explain to a layman that this could have happened? Because it just looks so unlikely.
It's always like that, Last year, I've been working on the Titanic project. The Titanic himself was supposed to be unsinkable, and the submarine was also supposed to be safe, but it wasn't, And this year we've got this boat who somebody says it wasn't sinkable, but every vessel is sinkable, for any reason. It's of course it's a coincidence because the weather was pretty good. Everything was pretty okay. It's a big boat. It's a safe boat, and nobody can predict such a tornado there in this place. It's no one can predict that.
And do you think that we're likely to? What is the likelihood of a definitive answer as to why this happened? At the beginning, you mentioned how there are so many different factors at play. Are we likely to be able to eventually pinpoint one cause, or do you think there's always going to be an element of mystery in this sinking?
I think, again, it's just a speculation, but you will have, when you will work, when I work for the courts, for the justice, our mission is to be the closer as possible from the truth. So I think it will be the same, on this case, and the investigator and surveyor, the marine surveyor, will have to be as close as possible from the truth. Will all the elements they will mix together, but they will need for that, to have all the declaration, all the witnesses of survivors, all the information from divers, all the information from the ROV, the robot, and then they will come inside the boat once it will be salvaged, because it has to be salvaged due the international law anyway. And when all the marine surveyor, because I suppose there will be quite a few marine surveyors in this case, when all the marine surveyors will have all the information, they will try to speak together and make then some hypothetical solution to say, look, we are pretty sure it's done like that. And sometime, not all the time, sometimes you have still some mystery, but sometimes you can say, look, okay, we know at 100% what happened, and it's happened like that. And I hope in these stories it will end like that,
In airline disasters, it often relies on what's called the black box, and that often reveals so much about why an aircraft crashes. Is there anything similar on a boat which gives us data, communications between the bridge and the Coast Guards or anything like that, voice recordings that can help beyond, as you say, the witness statements and the evidence that the divers or ROVs can see?
No, there is nothing like that on board. It's internationally on the way to be like that, but for bigger boats. For ferries or thing like that, when we salvage fishing vessels, we try to take off to salvage first the computers, which is inside the wheelhouse. And on the computer, you already have some information because the hard disk is under pressure, And sometimes we can we can take up all those information. But in this case, I really don't know what they kept in terms of informatic or information. But for sure, it's not. There is no obligation on the boat to have such a black box.
On the tragedy of the Concordia, the ferry that sank, it was 2 years before the vessel was eventually salvaged. How long does this process take?
Oh, it's quite different. The Concordia was a big, very big ferry, and it was half sunk. By the way, it was not completely sunk. What about is half sunk? It's more difficult, because you have to imagine a solution to be half on the water and half under the water. In this case, it's completely different. The boat is completely sunk, is at 50 meters. And again, the mast is 70 meters. So I suppose there will be certainly some proposal of method, different method. But for myself, I think I would try to first put the boat on his keel with the help of the mast, And when a boat is on his keel, then you can keep it with slings underneath, and a big barge and a big crane can salvage the thing. But if the mast will help at first, it will certainly be a problem later. So they will have to cut the mast, I suppose, before salvaging the whole thing.
So do you think it will be months before we get anywhere near what might be the truth of what has happened, or is it a process that takes counting into the years rather than the months?
No. It can be done in months, but you imagine that will cost quite a lot of money, and as all the media of the world is looking at this sinking vessel, and as I suppose with all those rich people on board, you've got an army of lawyers going on this thing as well, plus the authorities. I think all those people will have to speak together to find the right company who can salvage it, and then to accept the right method to keep the boat mostly intact, to give them to the surveyor. I mean, for myself, when I work for the justice or for insurance or in penalty clubs or anything, when we have some kind of tragedy or dramas, with people dying, I always need to have the more intact possible for the vessel when it's salvaged. So then we can start the proper survey of the sunken vessel. But sorry for that. But just to answer to your question, the longer I think will be to make all those people together to be okay. But the salvage itself will take certainly a few weeks, but not in terms of years.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sciboz, for joining us. Well, Tim, let's have a little look at those GCSE results that have been announced today for England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Of course, Scotland has a different exams system. 3 big areas. The ones you've pointed out, private schools versus state education, the north-south divide, and I think a third one, which is the male-female split. So, in terms of the gap in top grades between private and comprehensive schools, that's widened to 29 percentage points, up from 28.2 percentage points in 2023. Let's look at the north-south divide. 28.5% of pupils in London were awarded the top grades of A7. That's just a little higher than last year, but it's 3 percentage points higher than in 2019. Let's compare that with the northwest of England, where it remained on 18.6%. And if you look at the northeast of England, it's 17.8%. So quite a gap there. Let's look at that male-female split. This year, 24.7% of entries from girls were graded at least a 7 or A. That's come down slightly from 24.9% last year. But for boys, the proportion fell from 19.1 percentage points to 19%, so a gap of nearly 5%. Let's kick off, though, with the private schools point.
I feel like I've sat at GCSE.
By listening to those. Yes, I hope everyone else has followed.
And I do not understand how overall boys and girls attainment can fall slightly, but overall things can improve among both comprehensive and private schools. But either way.
Yes, we'll get a statistician on next time.
Yeah,
but let's kick off with private schools. And your argument, Tim, which I believe we'll be able to discuss robustly, that given that private schools are doing so well in exams, why on earth would Labour want to tax them to force some parents to... Why would Labour want to tax them more?
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that both comprehensive and private schools have done slightly better this year. It's the gap between their performance that is troubling. Well, is it troubling, though? If something's working, why break it? If there's a bit of the education system which is flourishing and which gets such excellent results, rather than taxing it, shouldn't we be thinking, how do we emulate it and copy it? Let's definitely keep it, because it's obviously helping a lot of people, but also, how can we do what they're doing in state schools?
Well, we could kick off by spending much more per pupil in state schools, and that might mean more tax. If you want to emulate the private sector, you would have many, many more teachers ratio for pupils. You would spend much more per pupil, and you would spend much more on what are described as extracurricular activities for students to be able to take part in, if you did want to emulate that. But surely, Tim, to do that, you need more funding, and to get more funding, one way to do that is to tax more, and so therefore by the VAT change on private schools will help state education emulate just the successes that you are lauding today.
I mean, one thing on the extracurricular activities, I don't believe they make any difference to academic performance. I mean, the fact that a private school might have fencing doesn't mean people are going to do better at geography, GCSE, does it? But on the finance question, that you may well be right, that it is about the money that goes to the individual pupil or the school. But first of all, does it logically follow, therefore, in order to finance that, you have to take money away from the private system to put it into the public? Why not take the money from some other sphere of the taxing take? Why should it be redistributive within schools? That sounds punitive, rather than just simply... I mean, if they were just arguing we need to spend more money on teachers in state schools, fair enough, but there's a punitive element to this, isn't it? Which is that we're going to take that money from parents who would otherwise send them to private schools.
I suppose the idea is that are these really charities, and therefore you have to make choices, and if the other choices are less palatable, well, it's for private schools to find ways of managing their money more successfully, and actually parents having to pay more of the full cost of the rather wonderful education. As you say, look at the outcomes. The rather wonderful education you get in private schools is just going to become more expensive. I think if you look at London, and this takes us into the second point, which is about this north-south divide, what happened in London, I think, is a microcosm of how education policy in the state sector should work. Blair famously said, education before 1997. A huge amount of reform and funding went into London schools. I was actually a parent, rather fortunately, through a lot of that period in London with young children. The schools were revolutionised. They were rebuilt. Focus on standards was much clearer. Many, many middle-class parents who may well have sent their children to private school no longer needed to.
Yeah.
Your local comprehensive became excellent. And just like in France, where private school is not done because of standards, but is done for many, many other reasons, and is not seen as a way of giving your child a head start in the educational race. I would love to see here, private schools, of course, should be a choice. Parents should be able to take the choice of private schooling. But it should be a choice where the state system, which is much more where we are in London now, is properly funded and is rigorously regulated so that standards are as high as in the private sector. But it was that injection of money that allowed the revolution in London schools, which should be the blueprint for what we have in the rest of England. And clearly, because it hasn't been, and that funding has not been done and promoted in the same way in other parts of England, we have this gap. It is a disgrace that if you are a child outside London, the education service you receive from the state is poorer. To be clear, leads to poorer outcomes.
I couldn't agree more. And it's because of, yes, the Blair era followed by academisation. That's one reason why private schools now cost so much money, because they had to compete with the state sector now because the state sector was getting so good, which is why they had to give all these ridiculous add-ons so that, I know one person who, I'm told of one person who goes to a private school where they have personal trainers on site that just walk around with clipboards observing the children and sort of asking them if they want to do any sports or work out or check their health and nutrition. I mean, this is insane. So partly because state schools did so well that the others became so expensive. But there are two other things that factor into the London story. One is immigration, which is that a lot of the people who are doing very well in London schools are born abroad, and they bring with them the immigrant work ethic, which is not here present, unfortunately, in Britain, and particularly among the working class. And the second thing is, you mentioned in passing standards, not just money, but also standards.
Absolutely.
And one thing London schools started to do was become a little more disciplinarian, put more emphasis upon things like uniforms and behaviour, and some of them, through things like academies, effectively started internal streaming. They were imitating the grammar schools, but just not sifting out at the age of 11. So I couldn't disagree with you. I just think that we should be honest about what makes schools work. It is high standards, discipline, and a bit more money, yes. But that means, again, I come back to imitating what the private schools do so well. And I didn't go to a private school, by the way, but I did briefly work in one. And one thing that really impressed me was the sense of collegiate identity. When I was young in the 1750s, state schools did not tend to have that sense of identity. But then when I went and worked in this private one, I was really impressed by how they had a strong sense of pride and of the virtues of going to that particular school. So I'm just, copy them. But why finance this revolution from destroying the one bit of the education system which is really taking off at the moment, which is the private bit? That's the punitive, unnecessary thing.
It won't destroy it. It just means that there'll be...
It'll put it beyond the reach of middle-class
private
parents.
School fees have gone up considerably without this tax change that is coming down the track. Okay, let's move on. I think there's always one thing which curmudgeonly people, maybe like old men like us, shouldn't forget. Congratulations is worth saying for everyone who has done well in their GCSE.
Yeah, by the way,
what you
done.
What you often get in these conversations, particularly between two journalists, is, yes, but here are all the problems, or here are all the issues. But actually, we should of course say to everyone who has done so well in their GCSE, this generation have had a school career through COVID, which has been absolutely disastrous, and there are many schools that have not done enough to get the standards of education back to where they were pre the pandemic. And there needs to be some focus on that. So given that this generation are the generation who were so hugely affected by the lockdowns, by the closure of schools, by online learning, which clearly disproportionately affected poorer pupils from less economically rich backgrounds who didn't have the facilities in front of them. So I think that's something to think about. Let's, Tim, though, talk about the male-female split and how it is girls now who are well ahead of boys at GCSE, but throughout the education system. Probably quite rightly, this has been a reversal over a number of decades that has been happening rather slowly. Education obviously changed towards more continuous assessment, less reliance on simply exams or more traditional methods of testing education. But Tim, is it something we should be concerned about? I must admit, I find it hard to think, how do we get changes beyond the point you make, which seems to have affected boys more than girls, the idea of work ethic and what success looks like and why you need to strive hard at school to be successful in the game of life?
Well, we've got to be wary of grade inflation. It's actually not necessarily a bad thing if overall success doesn't rise that high, because it probably means that the grades aren't worth what they used to be. And there is always in any generation people who are not academic and are not going to thrive. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, so long as they then have other vocational qualifications and jobs to go on to. I think the obsession with what is the implication of everyone always worrying about these sorts of results? It should be closer to 100% of people getting all A's. That's nonsense. That's just not how nature or life works. The other thing I would say is that if there is such a large difference between girls and boys favouring girls, I mean, we're talking 24.7% of entries from girls graded at least a 7 or an A compared to 19% for boys. At what point do we stop talking about the disadvantage of girls in education? Because that, to me, seems to be all anyone ever talks about, is how many girls are doing science and things like that. And our society is so sexist, and there's so much toxic masculinity out there. At what point do girls just do so well that we eventually admit that, okay, they're doing okay?
We will need to change the tone of a lot of the conversation so that we are focusing on boys. I think it's absolutely, it doesn't mean you want the whole to increase, but you certainly want to look at why is there that gap, and are there gender reasons for that gap, and we should be talking more about boys. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I think you can talk still about girls, and obviously as they get into the workplace, systemic hurdles still exist. So it doesn't mean you stop talking about girls and promoting that they have a broad set of career choices ahead of them, and they shouldn't constrain themselves because of what some people think girls should do. And that was true, Tim, in my generation, that girls weren't seen as doing the same careers as boys. And if you look in science, etc., it's still worth having that conversation, because that's not been completely
and later
solved.
on, and when it comes to careers, that might all be true. But looking at these stats, it just looks to me like girls have got no problem and not facing any kind of prejudice whatsoever, because they're beating the boys hands down.
Yeah, so maybe it's time to focus on the boys a little more, while still, of course, promoting girls.
Well, promote both equally, but there's also a part of me that wonders if actually the emphasis in the conversation upon girls actually puts some boys off learning. If education's become sort of feminized in its interests and it's in the way it's done. I don't know. Clearly, boys are not engaging with school for some reason, and I wonder if actually the emphasis upon girls discourages them.
Not all boys, I'm sure, Tim. Many boys have done very well today. Many girls have done very well today. We congratulate them all. You can write to us, of course, about this and any of the other issues that we've touched on today at thedailyt@telegraph.co.uk. Do connect with us on our socials, X, Instagram and TikTok at Daily T Podcast.